I think a key role for technology is helping us see the patterns that we can't see ourselves about ourselves. As we get more granularity and ability to parse increasingly subtle patterns in the data about ourselves, it might be able to tie spikes in heart rate or biometric fluctuations to certain events that happen in our life or certain thought patterns. I think we're just going to be able to get a little bit more granular with the kind of data we have, and that unlocks knowing ourselves, not only on an individual level, but it can also help the human organism to know itself. I'm imagining a future in which you can see when a certain policy or a change in material conditions leads to a spike in people's anxiety or stress or an increase in a certain ideology, and get really clear on what is important to us, but also what is important to the human, and hopefully can help us see ourselves within this connected network as part of this broader creature that is humanity.
Welcome to Humans on the Loop, episode 19. I'm Michael Garfield, and this week we're asking, what the hell is going on with culture right now? The web is running evolution in fast forward, remixing the very substrates of identity and personhood in a molten broil of post-ironic, post-human, post-truth meme play that reminds me of nothing more than the porous networked selfhood of bacteria in a molten wash of horizontal gene transfer. Rest in peace, genres, and all hail the hyper-real individual as institution, the self-fulfilling prophecies of Baudrillard's Society of the Spectacle, the revenge of religion as our accelerating techno-social evolution prompts a kind of reversal as the movement of the Tao that challenges the dreams and ideals of the Enlightenment. This is a time of monsters, a rapid recombination of worlds and ways of living in them. How to make sense of it all? Or is making sense even a viable strategy when rifts and ruptures are the name of the game? Amidst the chaos of pop culture and mainstream news, my friend Rina Nicolae swims comfortably as a thoughtful commentator, riffing philosophically on network society and its discontents, the emergent spiritual traditions of digital natives, and the post-human bestiary of our AI and biotech-saturated century. Rina's Substack Incognita is a handbook to the cyborg aesthetic, the imagistic and algorithmic complex of online identity, our entanglement with capital, and our possession by and performance of meme space. How do we not become caricatures of ourselves in the world-creating and world-destroying flood of remix culture? How do we cultivate our roughness, fractality, wildness, illegibility? How do we stay, as Cadell last put it in the previous episode, in the gaps and cracks instead of becoming prey to the new monsters of our unleashed collective imagination? And how do we befriend those monsters? William Irwin Thompson said noise characterizes the emergence of planetary culture, an age in which technology slays the victim of the mind and resurrects it as art in a new ecology of consciousness. If then the only way through is up and out, then join me as once more we dive into the noise and make music together with Rina. Before we start, thank you for listening, and if you enjoy this episode, please like, subscribe, comment, and consider becoming a member and joining our inspiring live discussions at Substack or Patreon. Context is king, not content. And while members do, of course, get access to a deep trove of exclusive writing and episodes, the most valuable thing right now is the chance to find the others and participate in the formation of what Thompson called a musical noetic polity with the other amazing people this work continues to constellate. Right now, I'm raising money to grow that noetic polity by attending the Diverse Intelligences Summer Institute in Scotland, a world-class nexus of leading-edge researchers and artists exploring the fundamental theory of intelligence, who collectively present an amazing opportunity to build community for wisdom and technology projects, as well as to go fishing for mind expanding new guests on the show. Leaving the country for 3 weeks with my kids to participate is an out of pocket expense, but it'll feed our discourse and applied projects for a long time to come. So let me hang some bait for your membership. I'm sitting on 6 months of unreleased episodes right now. And if I reach 300 paid subscribers or find a patron to cover the cost of this trip, I'll upload them all and every new recording to a private archive so you don't have to wait for months to stay up to date on the ideas this project is midwifing. So there's that. Stay tuned for more wonderful guests and much more writing this summer on the history of simulation, the magic of code, wisdom and human-machine collaboration, and how to navigate our increasingly hallucinatory evolution of culture and consciousness at humansontheloop.com. And join me in giving thanks to Rina Nicolae for her thoughtful contributions to this discourse. Enjoy. All right. Hey, Rina Nicolae. I'm glad to have you on the loop.
Hi, Michael. It's great to be here. I've been listening to your podcast for a couple years. It's one of my favorites, so it's an honor to be here.
So, yeah, this is a Twitter friendship. I like when they jump the rails and disintermediate themselves and you actually get to know somebody. And yeah, you just have said so many interesting things that when you started Incognita, I was hyped. And yeah, it's a funny case. There's a category of desired guests on this show that are just like quote unquote ordinary people, but like demonstrate the ability to think deeply and to observe things without having some kind of fancy affiliation or a platform. And I don't know, part of it is just like my appreciation for the, like when Priya Rose talked about what an independent research PhD would look like in this world. Like, how is it that we can live lives of scholarship and then make our knowledge and our expertise legible to other people without conventional credentials? You're someone that I think is really worthwhile as a mind on the topics that are relevant to this show, but isn't like part of the machine of the production of intellectuals. And so that makes it kind of doubly interesting.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. I have shed all my institutional credentials over the past few years. And yeah, I realized that I kind of want to forge my own path rather than attaching myself to any given structure that exists prior in society. I'm stepping back and trying to critically examine the things I want to be a part of and things that I don't. And then from there, choosing to, I don't know, opt back into some and not others, maybe, or just doing my own thing for a while.
So I want to start by having you give people a bit of an autobiography. I
Great.
think it would be just as a way of addressing the way
Mhm.
that you think and what you're choosing to write about for your blog and why you care about this stuff is the best way to situate what it is we're going to talk about today. And we can start with the person and then we can get into the philosophical reflections.
Great. That sounds good. I'm in my mid-20s, so a journey that I'm just now beginning. I went to Harvard for undergrad. From there, I went to Wall Street doing investment banking. From the start of my professional career, I was on this super rigid, career-driven path that I very quickly realized was not for me. COVID came around, I moved to LA, did a couple other jobs within that corporate world, and then I decided that I would take a step back from all that and then really try to develop my thinking a little bit more. I noticed that the people around me just weren't thinking about the same kinds of questions that I was, weren't really interested in the same kinds of thing that I was, and that kind of motivated me to say, am I really a fit for this world that I'm stepping into, or is it another path that I should pursue? So for the past year, I've spent my time really following what makes me intellectually curious. And that includes really a lot of thinking about how society operates, but then also about technology. So I got really into reading theory and also philosophy, specifically post-human philosophy, because I think that framework helps us understand the moment we're living in now, which is this intersection of culture and society with the force of technology. And technology's always been something that moves culture and moves material conditions, which then changes the kinds of ideas that people have and the kinds of things people believe. But this moment feels particularly and strange because we're seeing technology mutate reality in increasingly strange ways, whether that's brain organoids hooked up to each other in a computer that then gets rewarded by literal shots of dopamine to the system, or whether that's the phenomenon of the social media influencer that is inherently entangled with these algorithms and systems of technology and capitalism in one. So we're seeing all sorts of these hybrid forms that make reality particularly strange in this moment. My blog on Substack is called Incognita. It takes the form of a critical theory tabloid. So it's a mix of high and low culture. It discusses pop culture, technology, society, cultural trends, but then takes a little bit of a more academic and theoretical lens on some of these things that I'm observing.
So you've written a few pieces for this blog on the relationship between technology and religion and culture that I found especially interesting. And maybe the right place to start is up in the like Harvard stratum
Mm.
of the introductory piece on what is posthumanism, because defining it as you have, I feel like a lot of people get this confused. You did a good job of disambiguating that transhumanism is not posthumanism, nor is it a type of posthumanism. And I feel like in my own efforts to thread the needle with a critical stance about technology, but a curiosity and an interest in the new kinds of self that are emerging within the built environment,
Mm.
that I terrify a lot of people, that a lot of people are engaging with the bewildering pace of change. It's like meeting someone in a dark alley and you don't have time to get to know them. And so this is how police shootings happen. We feel like the stakes are very high. And so we retreat into category, and that the category that people on either extreme of the technology conversation are leaning on is very fear-based or rapturous, eschatological. And that's different than the kind of nuanced thinking that a lot of post-humanist scholarship has brought to this stuff. So, like, I would love for you to talk a little bit about actually not just what is posthumanism, but also the piece that you wrote on Prophets of a Machine Future
Mm.
about effective accelerationism and the way that techno-capitalist thinking has become a largely unwitting reskin of Christian eschatology. And I think how you see the differences between those things and how those distinctions are showing up in the literature is like a good place to start.
Yeah, great. So posthumanism, I would define it as a group of philosophies that comes out of the mid 20th century and then continues to the present day. Some key philosophers within that movement are Donna Haraway with her Cyborg Manifesto, more recently Rosie Braidotti, who's an Italian philosopher whose life work is about posthumanism and posthuman feminism. I would say posthumanism has a few maybe key characteristics. The first is that it decenters the human. It engages with this idea that the world does not revolve around the human. And over the last few hundred or thousand years, we've been stuck in this philosophical mindset where it still has a lot to do with human consciousness and human perception and the world of human things. Posthumanism is saying, let's zoom out a little bit and let's see the whole planet. So in that, it's post-anthropocentric, where the species of the human is decentered to the whole picture of what is going on in the planet. It challenges traditional dichotomies between, for example, culture and nature, mind and body, the individual and the collective, the natural and the synthetic. These are all troubled by technology. And posthumanism says instead of appealing to nature as a marker of what's right, we should accept that nature is malleable. And these boundaries are simply concepts created by the human mind to keep things in line. But actually, the reality is that these boundaries are much more complex and much more porous. And we see today with technologies that cause us to really question these boundaries between natural and synthetic, for example, with various gene editing technologies, having us question the nature of intelligence with technologies like AI. These boundaries are becoming blurred before our very eyes. And then I would say another characteristic that goes along with that is the rethinking of agency. So when you realize you're part of an interconnected node that is affected by everything else, and you're not really a solid, stable entity, it causes a rethinking of agency in which you really can't look at just the individual scale anymore. You must look at all the various interconnections, all the various forces that shape an individual's agency. So it's shifting from looking at an agent as an individual to a node within a network, let's say. So I would say that's the basis of posthumanist thinking. It's this kind of emphasis on the dissolution of boundaries through technology, this anti-naturalist stance where anything can be malleable and we should use technologies to improve things. But then with that also comes a rethinking of agency and a rethinking of our interconnectedness with other people, other animals, other species, and also with the broader planet as a whole. With this eschatology question that you were interested in, I wrote a piece called Prophets of a Machine Future that addresses this trend in Silicon Valley of EAC, or effective accelerationism, which is a way of thinking about AI as this inevitable end towards which humanity should apply all its efforts. We need to get AGI because that is like the next stage of consciousness. That's going to help us rise in the scale of civilizational might, harness more energy from the sun, make the species multiplanetary, and importantly, not just the species, but make consciousness multiplanetary. So it's this kind of almost teleological drive towards a state of more powerful consciousness and a more powerful civilization. And to me, this train of thought, which is really popular now among young people in tech and young people in AI, and it's definitely gained more of a following online on Twitter. The discourse around this train of thought is really vocal. To me, this seems kind of like misplaced religious fervor that doesn't have an outlet in our kind of industrial, hyper modern, technologically enabled society, and especially in Silicon Valley. And so this religious fervor takes the shape of the culture it was born in, which is this focus on optimization and productivity towards greater and greater ends. And then the end result of this is this kind of cold and calculating machine god, basically. And so a lot of people in this community will phrase it as, we're creating a machine god. We are bringing about a deity on the planet that is going to help us transcend the base of humanity in its purely material state. And merge consciousness with it and become multiplanetary. So yeah, to me, this kind of is like the second coming of Christ and the apocalypse. It's a lot of this kind of imagery. But I think that perspective is perhaps a limiting one because it shapes the nature of this new invention, this new technology that we really have no clue what it is actually going to end up as, but it unnecessarily pre-shapes it in the image of a deity, which I think is interesting and powerful because we see time and again that our stories of how we think things should be and our stories about the future, our myths often actually have a sort of gravitational pull where they act as a target, actually shape the trajectory of the future in the image of those stories. So because we have this image of this god, will it affect the way that AI actually manifests in the world? Maybe. It seems like it maybe already is.
Yeah, one of the things that I would like to provoke in this conversation is a reflection on where narrative production is actually happening. You make a point in this article on accelerationist prophecy that this is all based on a big story of thermodynamics. I think about my buddy Bobby Azarian, and he's been immensely successful in the wake of writing his book, The Romance of Reality, which, an attempt to synthesize all of the research on complex systems and thermodynamics and self-organization into something like a substantiated secular religious framework to explicate all of the thinking that's going into this sort of David Deutsch beginning of
Mm.
infinity attitude toward marshaling human energies toward the production of machine superintelligences. And on one level, it's hard for me as an evolutionary biologist not to accept that the trend in evolution is toward more and more diverse intelligences, greater symbiotic unities of intelligences, that the planet is in any way that is meaningful to us more intelligent than it was 4 billion years ago or a billion years ago, that this is driven by evolution as a process that finds free energy and uses it in processes of active inference to minimize uncertainty, but then exports uncertainty and then thereby creates more and more opportunity for an ever more incalculable, like the horizon of incalculability. We never actually reach it. We just
Mhm.
keep growing and evolving and expanding into it. And so on one level, I am sympathetic to this. On another level, all of the reasons that it seems problematic have to do with the fact that this story is grounded in a kind of rationalist objective bias that this is the truth about the world when on the other hand you've got the posthumanist position that you outlined here, that you summarized a history of, is one that troubles the distinctions between self and other. Like you said, that it makes it clear that there's a cognitive dissonance, I feel like, in how people can say, we are information processing systems, we are algorithmic processual entities, and yet this is the truth,
Mhm.
and are making doctrine of the current state of physical and
Mhm.
psychological knowledge to extrapolate into futures that they admit are completely ineffable, and to say, you know what, we're going to recruit the entire economic apparatus of our planet and the ecological
Yeah.
material and energy systems that underlie that in service of this. And so it is still very much an ideology, and it's an ideology that seems to me as transparently in conflict with itself as like radical is postmodernism, going out there and saying no position is absolutely true except for this one. I'm going to bounce back and forth between like 5 of your pieces here in our conversation, one of which is the piece that you wrote on the new Monstrous, because you link this weird world that you mentioned earlier about, digital, organic, hybrid intelligences and the body as a site for technological manipulation. And you compare it to Jack Halberstam's writing on monsters as entities that trouble boundaries and categories.
Mhm.
They're chimeric and they're metamorphic. And so they unsettle us precisely because we recognize self and others simultaneously. And then also Julia Kristeva's notion, which I is totally unfamiliar to me. I love this, of abjection, which is very similarly the abject, as you write, exists outside the symbolic order, but not entirely separate from it, embodying what is cast out and othered, yet inescapably linked to the subject, blurring the distinctions necessary for maintaining identity. So it's like what I'm hoping to do with this show is to get people comfortable with the ways in which what we're living through right now is sensible through frameworks that already exist and have for some time about the self as strange, like the way that Timothy Morton has written about the radical otherness of the body as an object that we can never fully understand,
Yeah.
or the ways that our cognitive limitations draw a kind of pragmatic envelope around selfhood that the instruments of modern technology, telescope, microscope, big data analysis have all complicated by viewing. It's like in your point about the posthuman as a node in a network, like take it a step further into the self as a multi-scale network,
Mhm.
right? In the way that like K. Otto McDowell talks about AI and brain computer interfaces, showing that the stories that we write about ourselves are abstracted or they're embeddings in a much larger space of possibility, and that the causal mechanistic frameworks that we come up with through science and reason run up against the induction problem, like the fact that we can never actually prove those interpretations to be true, that there's always another way of looking at
Mm.
things. Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of abyssal horror in all of this, but if you go all the way back to the legible origins of a lot of this in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster is a very sympathetic character and in many ways a far better exemplar of the nobility of our humanity than Frankenstein himself. Now the question is like, without trying to respond in a kind of inflammatory, oversimplified way to all of the crazy shit that's going on right now, how does your research, your reading, your personal experience make sense of how to actually embrace our post-humanity? What governance and economic systems emerge? What will the human conscious experience feel like? What values should be prioritized? And that by viewing AI as an unstoppable godlike force beyond our control, we abdicate our responsibility to consciously direct its development. So we have this paradox, right? It's like,
Mhm.
on the one hand, we know that this is fundamentally mysterious. On the other hand, we have to do something. We're not actually making anything that we can legitimately call progress if we relinquish our agency to physics or to finance
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
this is like our addiction to
Systems of
profit
capital.
or yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think you really hit the nail on the head with that. It's a paradox of, do we become actively involved in its shaping or do we not? Because we see that sometimes when we do become actively involved, it does take the shape of maybe something unintended or something that might not be the best thing to bring about into reality. And it also unnecessarily constrains possibilities. Like you were saying, it's working with where we are now and the current human consciousness and the current values of a society. So then do we imprint these things on this technology that comes next with unintended effects, or do we just let it develop on its own? It's a paradox. And the thing that makes it paradoxical is the fact that AI to us right now fundamentally unknowable. So we're faced with this situation where we're meeting this great otherness, this unknowable kind of otherness. And it's causing this paradox in ourselves where we don't really know what to do in the face of that. And the same with other technologies too. Like we see all sorts of mutations of different forms. For example, the skin covered robot with its pink shiny face and its mechanical eyes poking through. It does elicit this feeling of disgust. The researchers were trying a kind of a skin layer for these robots to make them appear more human-like. So that's something that I find really interesting because it's like, why do you need to make that more human-like? Why don't you just let it be a robot? Let it be how it is and not constrain it in the image of a human. And I think that principle, it's a post-human one that decenters the human in this picture, but I think that principle is an interesting one to look at in this current landscape because, like in the case of the robot and even in the case of AI, by shaping it to be in the image of a human, you constrain it and you turn it into something that is like a degenerate version of a human, which is what causes this kind of disgust and repulsion thing. I think what I'd like to see is a more decentered perspective around how to build these things, decentered from the human experience and human values, where it's like you can give it freedom to be whatever it's going to be. Because maybe AI is a completely different type of entity. Its mind will work in a completely different way that's maybe more akin to a different kind of intelligence we have on the planet, or maybe something that's not even on the planet at all. But I think by constraining it around humanity, you narrow down its possibilities. Benjamin Bratton talks about this. He mentions this term called epistemic technologies, which are basically technologies that change the way we view the world. They change our consciousness about reality. And AI is one of these tools that has the potential to vastly open up how we see reality, has the potential to generate completely new thoughts that would not come from a human mind at all. But by shackling this thing to first century human values, you essentially also shackle its possibility for it to be revelatory in that way. And so, in a sense, it's like giving in to the unknown where there's something very powerful on the horizon. But if you tie it too much to be intelligible to the human, maybe you never get that phase shift in consciousness. But then on the other hand, yeah, if you let it be completely unconstrained, who knows? Do you run a risk there? Like an existential type of risk? I don't know. I don't know. I would advocate for balance and for humility in the development of these things. Yeah, respect and humility, almost treating it like another entity that is deserving of respect on the planet. Yeah.
I wonder about the value of leaning in to the religious, because obviously not all religion is obsessed with eschatology. I've spoken to a lot of practitioners of interfaith traditions over the years who remind us that there's a kind of a hierarchical order within which we can understand that the like Book of Revelation and other eschatological texts and prophecies are mythological in the formal sense that they are unfolding at all times in the way that creation is unfolding at all times, and that to place them along a timeline is misplaced concreteness,
Mm.
that the world is always beginning and always ending, and that where that actually leaves us is not in a preoccupation with the fulfillment of prophecy, but in a much more complex and challenging consideration of how to live right now. That, like, this is not about waiting for the world to end or helping the world end or participating in Genesis, except in that these are concerns that arise uniquely for everyone in every moment in every generation. And so, like, to the extent that reason is literally built out of mythic thinking in the brain, the ability to craft stories and characters and to assemble them on timelines and to understand cycles and so on is necessary in order to be able to reflect critically on all of that stuff. I kind of want to lean in with you because you make the point in your piece on the new Monstrous. You're like, I love the etymology. I'm a big fan of that turn in writing. You remind us that the Latin monstrare is to show or to reveal, monere, to warn, to pretend. And this has direct links to the apocalypse as an unveiling.
Yeah.
That you say monsters play a revelatory role in society. They expose what we identify with in the human by defining what is other to us. And that, again, that's a moving target. I feel like it's a more interesting world in which we don't necessarily collapse the question of whether AI ought to be treated as a distinct entity or as a reflection of ourselves. We certainly live in a more pluripotent world if we allow people to explore both options and every other variation. And so, at any rate, that's all just to lead in because one of the other pieces that you wrote recently on Milady of Love and Light, on Remilia Corporation's Milady NFTs and their weird similarity to the Vatican's mascot, this weird
Mhm.
anime looking
Mhm.
Catholic pilgrim or Luce,
Yeah.
which I was like, really? Lucifer? Like, you're okay, whatever, fine. But there's this, I was delighted that you took some time to explore the cultural phenomenon of the resurgence of Catholicism as an aesthetic and its relationship to anime and to cuteness and to all of this, because like you talk about in your writing on the Monstrous, there's something about the chibi or the kawaii and the mascotization
Mhm.
of religion that has strong resonances with the process of domestication, the
Mm.
fact that we as a species are like cuter by virtue of having domesticated ourselves,
Mhm.
this weird preoccupation that we have with making robots cute and familiar and interoperable with us. And I mean, it's like adjacent to like the waifu AI phenomenon also.
Yeah,
And like,
totally.
what's going on here and how are you making
Totally
sense?
is. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like as humans, we have this drive towards cuteness where cuteness arises from our activities. Like, for example, the domestication of animals, dogs, to be hyper optimized, to be hyper cute. And then we do that with ourselves on the internet too. And in a way, Luce, she's so cute. I love her. How can you not love her? It was great, a great strategic move, I think. But she's the flip side of the monster. She's also this post-human form with these exaggerated features, these big eyes. She's a cartoon character. She's flat. She's a native of the two-dimensional image brought to life. But she is also a monster in the same way that all these like hyper-optimized dog breeds are also monstrous in the way that they blur these boundaries between the human and artificial, creating something a little bit uncanny. So, yeah, she's the flip side of this like disgust feeling that we might get when looking at like a brain organoid computer, this kind of mutilated collage of nature and technology, the opposite, where we get this feeling of cuteness, but also from her. exaggeration from her entanglement with technology. So, yeah, I think that's interesting because it's again this remixing of forms and this like hyper exaggeration, this malleability of the body and the image that gets really multiplied and accentuated online specifically. So in the piece, I talk about how the internet incentivizes these exaggerated forms of cuteness because you have to cut through the noise. The algorithm incentivizes behavior that's out and makes you pause and has you engage with it. And so you get these really hyper optimized forms of cuteness, but then also there's an element of like disembodiment. Anyone can be whoever they want to be online. So you get with various avatars in games or people with like anime profile pics on their X account. So this disembodiment also allows this freedom of forms for people and it gets heightened online. And then, yeah, it's also tied to certain cultural trends. And yeah, in the piece, I talk about how these aesthetics of religion and Catholicism got adopted by certain cultural scenes in the early years after the COVID pandemic, even a little bit before. There was this return to like trad cap or Catholic coquette aesthetics online where girls are wearing lace veils and praying and going to church. And it starts sarcastically, but it starts in this post ironic way where it's engaging with something for its aesthetic power. A lot of subcultures these days get flattened into aesthetics and then repackaged and then cycled through TikTok, through Instagram, through algorithmic means of image conveyance. These subcultures are repackaged as a flat image that anyone can then buy into the look. And so I think that's a little bit of what happened in those years, but I think it was driven by something a little bit deeper, which is this online world that feels really disconnected from everything and very chaotic and very fast paced. It was almost like people felt this instinctive need to return to a spiritual place, something with history, something with roots, because it does feel like reality, especially online reality, is lifting off from the physical world. So I think it was this desire to return to something with roots, but then it also became this thing that was associated with this changing tide of neo-reactionary, more right-wing thinking that had various political origins, but it became absorbed into this like edgy new online downtown subculture. And then all these things mush together. And then you get the same people who are into the tradcath stuff are the same people who are into the anime stuff. And so anime then becomes this vehicle for religious imagery almost. And then I talk about Remelia Corporation, which is an experimental art collective that comes out of the scene in 2019 or the early 2000s that to me exemplifies the nexus of these forces where they basically are a art collective that does NFTs. So they released a line of 10,000 NFTs called My Ladies. You might have seen them online. They're these chibi style anime profile pictures, and they're often juxtaposed with either images of violence, so like guns, fire, or heaven, angelic imagery, spiritual imagery, but definitely very much like Catholic and Western inspired religious imagery. And so this art collective comes out of this scene and does actually a pretty radical thing and uses the mechanisms of the internet itself to transmit these images as memes. They say we're post authorship. It's not about credit. It's basically meme as art. And then these things spread in a viral way. People remix them, made different art pieces using these characters, turned them into memes, and then they basically spread online using the mechanics of the internet itself to be a co-participant in this art project. And they call this immersion with the internet networked spirituality, which They speak about their founder, Charlotte Fang, speaks about this concept on their blog. It's a collection of all sorts of different ideas, and the core of it seems to be that it's this abandon to the mechanics of the internet and the internet as a spiritual place and as the whole arena of reality and the malleability of that and the protean nature of this ever shifting realm of information and memes and content and using that as your base material and your world within which to operate. Yeah, so it's a very interesting project. It takes art in a new direction, very online direction that reckons with the internet not as an afterthought or like a new force that arrives on the scene and must be critically engaged with, as a lot of post-internet art of the 2010s did. It's digitally native. It's the first project that really feels like it's using the internet in a way that it feels like it's at home there rather than feeling like it must critically engage.
So I want to just cite a piece of the writing of Remilia Corporation in this pull quote you take from their piece on networked spirituality, because I think that in understanding what an internet native institutional religion looks like, there's a refiguring of the institution that runs in parallel with the refiguring of the self in posthumanism. And I think you just spoke to some of that. And we don't need to define all these terms right now, but I want to lay this out as a groundwork for asking you my next question. You quote, network spirituality is the futurist embrace of experiential hyperreality found in the web's accelerated networks, a lens in which to efficiently and safely engage lucid virtuality and the internalization of its new cultural modes and mores. Though the esoteric school also furthers a Leninist occultism around persona egregores, I want to put a pin in egregores, positing the development of genuine spiritual entities spontaneously self-organized as hyper-real entities in the catalyzed collective consciousness, veritable deities, network angels and demons. And it's like, okay, here again we have this gesture toward this relationship between technology and transcendent intelligence, like the egregore as a hyperstition or a self-fulfilling prophecy that occultists have been playing around with for hundreds of years. It shows up in Tibetan traditions as the tulpa, in Jewish traditions as the golem, and everybody following the relationship between religious and magical literature and AI has drawn these connections already, that this is the terrain in which stories rupture the boundary that we have taken for granted between the real and the virtual for the last few centuries and are escaping our imagination into the wild. I want to link back to your piece on posthumanism because you mentioned in the posthuman bestiary CRISPR babies and other organisms with artificially altered genomes blurring the line between natural evolution and human design, and then make the point that this is already happening, that there's peer-reviewed research out there on various genetics laboratories that have been identified as having containment failures, and their experiments are ending up in the bloodstream of the researchers, and that human beings, we've learned in the last few decades of research, largely through our microbiota, through horizontal genetic transfer in the other supposedly non-human organisms that allow us to be human in the first place, that we're finding things like Monsanto gene sequences in our guts. And so, that this is, so there's two layers. There's that looking down into the way that the ideas that motivate research and design are resulting in very real physical and behavioral modifications to what we think of as the human. And then there's reaching up into our coevolution with those stories as distinct entities in their own right that may not precisely predate us. But if we like transect the sort of causal network, you can say that cultures and ideas cause humans as much as humans cause culture and ideas. And so, where this gets really interesting for me is this assumption that people have about what you said, lifting off from the physical world, that a lot of the accelerationist rhetoric and the transhumanist rhetoric is about ephemeralization, is about somehow escaping the imminent in the physical. But of course, like you said, people are choosing cute avatars online because it cuts through the noise, because it is hijacking human attention systems, because it competition for attention is a very old game in the biosphere that has to play by the rules of this active inference and free energy minimization that we were talking about earlier. And so what we're really looking at is all of this stuff is happening within a more than human logic that is grounded in materiality and in
Mhm.
metabolism. So this gets to this thing about like, okay, well, why are these the stories that the church and Remelia Corporation are stumbling on independently? Like, why is cuteness so strongly convergent?
Mhm.
And then I want to ask into this relationship between our subservience to extractivist thinking and ever greater efficiency and convenience through economies of scale, which is a kind of smoothing over of the complexity of the world
Mhm.
by rendering the singularity of each individual thing in the world as a bit stream in computers, or like five oranges, which we can now represent by a numeral, and
Mhm.
we can say
Mhm.
like five oranges
Mhm.
are in some sort of Platonic sense equivalent to five apples, and you can we can run calculations on that, and that's what afforded all of this. So the question is, what does it mean to not be cute? The reason I was so glad that you brought up cuteness in context with all of this stuff is that the acceleration is the fast, and the cute and the small are all very tightly knit in an associative framework. Like they're close in vector space. Small beings tend to be cute because they depend on parental care, and they happen to be fast because of scaling laws. They're just like my kids' heartbeats are so much faster than my heartbeat. And yet, not everything in the biosphere is cute. And smoothness versus roughness. So when I think of what it means to not be cute, there's a relationship with that. And I won't say like decelerationism exactly, but in an acknowledgement that resilience or anti-fragility as strategies depend on a balance between the sort of hyper-competitive short-term financialist thinking and long-term thinking about sustainability and adaptability. And the modern world has looked at nature and seen what looks like inefficiencies that have time and time again proven to have some sort of evolutionary utility once we actually understand things from a systems perspective.
Mhm.
So like, why do grandparents exist? They don't
Yeah.
reproduce anymore. The thing about the human life cycle is itself a kind of averaging of different life stages and different life functions and utilities. And if what this show is ultimately doing is asking about wisdom, then there's wisdom in acknowledging the appropriate context within which one is to be cute and one is to be fractal or rough or inefficient. And that gets
Mhm.
us back to the
Yeah.
monster, right?
Yeah.
So, like, that's the sigil I wanted to draw for
Mhm.
you, which is like, what are the stories that we are not telling that are like capacious enough to accommodate all of this hyper competitive race to the bottom Molochian war of the cute kind of thinking, and yet make room for multiple other strategies. And the last piece I'll tie into this is, again, in your posthuman bestiary, you mentioned that there are teams out there 3D printing coral reefs and restoring marine habitats affected by coral bleaching, blurring the boundary between the technological and the environmental. Like coral reefs are a very obvious place where roughness is working
Mhm.
out as a strategy, and cute
Mm.
little things like the world's most famous fish, the clownfish, exist in the coral reef, but so do like groupers and frogfish and stuff that people do not identify as cute that are relying on other strategies. What are the evolutionarily sustainable, ugly stories that we might want
Mhm.
to include along these? Because there is this balance that we have to draw between we should claim more agency in the telling of these self-fulfilling prophecies and the fact that the stories that clearly work in the world are stories that are able to find purchase and are able to establish themselves based on existing affordances. So like why not just lean into religion, but lean into religion in a smarter way?
Yeah. Yeah, these are all really good points. Okay, where to start with this? I think you make a lot of very interesting observations that are similar to my thinking on this. In terms of like the cuteness monstrous dynamic, they are two different polarities of this like post-human age. One is like the attractive pole and one is the repulsive pole almost. So I'm getting this image of like human energy in under these new set of postmodern conditions polarizes towards the formation of cuteness and has this like disgust or uncanny reaction with regards to the flip side of the sigil, which is like the monstrous. So yeah, and then I think it does have to do with the stories that catch on in a population and like the behavior that's incentivized given a certain set of initial conditions. And when you have something like an algorithm that is basically deciding what people's attention goes towards, it incentivizes certain behaviors and certain types of content. So cuteness, this hyper cuteness is born out of this machinic algorithmic thing. Yeah, it's an interesting image that you set forth about the cuteness and the monstrous dynamic. The other thing that I think about is this idea that you mentioned about the grandparents. What's the utility of having grandparents if they're no longer reproducing? It's this idea that in the genetic diversity of the human population, you have these mechanisms by which you avoid a disaster. So, like, certain types of humans are gonna be amazing in certain situations, and certain types of humans, given those same initial conditions, are gonna really struggle to, like, fit into society, versus if the conditions of the planet were different, maybe those ones that had previously struggled then fit in and become the main driving force of that society. So, I guess there's, like, something there about diversity and, like, the human system as an organism as a whole that has certain people in it or certain parts that do better in certain situations versus others. And then depending on the like material conditions and structure that we build onto the world, it enables certain types of people to do better in that situation versus 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. So like maybe the people that are doing better now because the conditions are right for them to like ride the wave are the people that are really comfortable spreading images of themselves across various algorithmic platforms and have that type of relationship to the self where they're using the self as material for their own co-creation, which kind of ties into my piece on Kim Kardashian, in which I analyze her as a cyborg that is simultaneously image and also corporation. So human as in her physical body, which she has notably modified to attain a very cyborgian aesthetic. Second is the image complex that she has around her. So she doesn't exist as Kim Kardashian in her own body exclusively. She exists as Kim Kardashian in this kind of complex of images that are all each a node in this entity that constitutes her cultural presence. So it's not just her body. She exists literally in this thing that is simultaneously embodied and disembodied. And algorithmically constructed. So she's entangled with technology already. You can't have a Kim Kardashian without having the algorithm and without having digital media. And then also, she is entangled with the forces of capital. She is a corporation in her own right. And the whole Kardashian family has managed to create a really sophisticated ecosystem where they're performing themselves. Their performances become content for their various image distribution machines, which are then harnessed to the machine of capital through their various business enterprises. So it's this really sophisticated ecosystem that they've managed to create. And in doing so, have transformed themselves in the process. They had to become a completely new kind of hybrid entity, a hybrid between the human, the image, and the corporation. It's the playbook for the influencer. And they were the first to really pull it off in such an industrial scale. That is the form of the influencer itself. It is a post-human hybrid of human image and capital. And what I think is quite interesting about the Kardashians is that they really take this dedication to the capital system so far, insofar as they're willing to sacrifice their own bodies, use their bodies and their image and their personal lives and every relationship and every conversation as material for the system. So they really are like alchemizing themselves into something new. It's a much more radical way of participating in capitalism than anything before. And then you see also people in a more who are capitalists and entrepreneurs in a more conventional sense, like tech CEOs now, a page out of the Kardashians book. Like Elon Musk is becoming a caricature of himself. He has created a sci-fi world. He's importantly been able to boil down his mission to one sentence, which is important because the easiest ideas are going to spread the fastest. The more complicated an idea is, the more you lose people on the way. So he's condensed his mission to one sentence, which is we must make humanity multiplanetary. And then he's created a sci-fi world via his tweets, via the images he chooses to share that paints a certain aesthetic of the sci-fi world and paints him as a character within it. He then embodies that character. He follows a certain set of aesthetic guidelines, like this Art Deco thing that he's doing with the cyber cab and Optimus, and the way he chooses to present himself by wearing all black and these graphic t-shirts that say Occupy Mars. He's becoming this character in this world that he's creating. And that's what the Kardashians do. The Kardashians were the ones to do it first. So then we get this crosstalk between this world of culture and media and then this world of more traditional capitalism and entrepreneurship and corporation building. So the self becomes the corporation and the corporation becomes the self.
So yeah, I just want to point out in your piece on Kim Kardashian, you make the point that she is poreless, that like she seems to have that the part of her cyborg identity is the perfect smoothness of her skin, and that she's constantly in these like skin tight nude colored outfits that again it's like she can't make herself chibi, but she can get real damn close
Mhm.
by just filing off
Mhm.
everything about the actual woman, and in some cases even like surgically
Yeah.
redistributing fat from her waist to her ass to create this image. I want to read a piece from the because all of this sounds horrible, but I am still committed to trying to understand what this logic offers those of us who are not just going to surrender our agency to the big machine.
Yeah.
I want to read a little piece of this essay for people. You say, Kim Kardashian may be a striking early example of an emerging paradigm in which capital accrues to those who can perform and commodify themselves best, who can most thoroughly transform themselves into human technology market assemblages. Under this new paradigm, technological mediation and market logic cease to be external forces and instead become the very substance of subjectivity. Labor becomes a constant process of self surveillance and self commodification that demands total integration with digital systems. I guess my question to listeners would be, in what way is this not already the case? Or can we become aware of the ways in which this has always been true for as long as we've been alive, or at least for as long as Marshall McLuhan talking about electronic media making the individual into an institution, right? Like the brand of Jimi Hendrix, the brand of Marshall
Mhm.
McLuhan.
Mhm.
And rather than assume that the only way to engage with this revelation is to retreat into the most efficient, expedient, cute, interoperable, domesticated version of the posthuman. The other question is, how do we literally afford the time and the attention to hold the process of inquiry open and make ourselves spacious enough to really confront and embrace and welcome and integrate all of the messy complexity of this sort of hyper object
Mm.
version of what we are. The line that you and others have drawn between attention and capital gets really concrete in terms of like, how do we innovate more wisely? How do we design technologies, including stories, that reward us for holding this quantum superposition of all of these different ways of seeing together rather than serving one of them, without
Yeah.
reducing everything to the subservience to the thermodynamic gradient. That takes work.
Yeah. One of the key issues there is to be able to tell that kind of story and to have it resonate with enough people and to spread, you need to have people be basically prepared to hear that story and understand it. And no one's going to care about that story if they don't have food on the table and they are scared, or someone has told them that we should be scared of immigrants coming into the country and crossing our borders. There's a competition in this marketplace for stories, and there's only a limited amount of human attention. And so the stories that resonate the most are going to spread, and those are stories that are going to be meeting us where we are as a society. And a story like one that you just set forth, which is a very important story, the interconnectedness of ourselves as nodes within this broader network that includes not just us as individuals, but all of humanity and all of the planet. That story is not going to be one that people care about when they're worried about all sorts of other things, when they have other allegiances like the nation or the church or the economic system, or if the story they really believe is chasing financial and material benefit is going to be what improves your life. They're not going to care about another story if they're fighting to survive and if they think that capital acquisition is going to be the way to outcompete other people so that they can ensure that they and their family survives. So I think you need to have a fertile ground for stories to be able to catch on. And I think we're not there yet. And it involves laying conceptual groundwork, but also kind of spiritual groundwork and psychological groundwork, because people's conscious experience really is what affects the stories that are going to resonate with them. And if their conscious experience is dominated by feelings of anxiety or fear, that's what's going to take priority. So I don't know. I think it's a complex problem. It has to do with it's tied into all the different realms of reality. And by that, the material conditions, the literal surroundings that people surround themselves with, the way they spend their time, the way their conscious experience looks. It also has to do with ideas and belief systems and cultural norms in a society, and also how those things get filtered through their unique conscious experience, whether they're scared or anxious or suffering from trauma or, have other things going on in their life. It's all filtered through everyone's conscious experience. So I don't know. It's a really hard problem. I think it has to do with shifting the consciousness of humanity. And there's various levers to pull in that endeavor. Yeah, until we're ready as a society to be in that receptive state for that particular story, I don't believe that it's going to catch on. So we must do the groundwork to hopefully get us closer to that.
This is where I wanted to end this too, because I feel like I have a working answer to some of these questions that I've been playing around with in a lot of the conversations I've had for this series. I've talked with Jim O'Shaughnessy, I've talked with Taryn Southern, and several others specifically about the use of the language models that exist today as tools for the enhancement of self-knowledge, for the promotion of metacognition, making it easier for people to afford reflective processes that are historically only available to the people who can afford a
Mhm.
therapist or
Yeah.
a mentor or something like that. One of the things that's come up again in the conversations, again and again in these conversations, is that there's a fairly robust argument that actually being able to think better and knowing oneself better does, in fact, confer a competitive advantage. And so, to your point about what it's going to take to get people out of a state of anxiety and complacency and to surrender themselves to stories without any kind of critical immune system. I realized that my goals for this particular show all ultimately boiled down to we have the option now to tell better stories. So let's dream better. And like
And
everybody wants to feel good as far as I can tell. So again, it's like if this is all really about addiction and gaming and the relationship between those things and then the access of like community accountability, oversight, multi-scale regulation and innovation, technological innovation as a form of parenting. It's like we actually have a rich body of literature and experience, like real hands-on practical experience in how to encourage learning and curiosity and play and to make it fun. And suddenly we have this remarkable opportunity to make these things not only fun, but to help us adapt ourselves into a world in which, as Kevin Kelly said in his book, The Inevitable, like one of the major trends that will continue to unfold over the course of our lives is one of constant becoming and lifelong learning and all
yeah.
this. So this is where I wanted to tie all of this into the essay that you wrote as your submission to the Cosmos Institute essay contest on AI and human flourishing. And specifically the line in there that you say AI reward functions could be fine-tuned to prioritize moments of surprise learning and fulfillment. And it's like, I just keep thinking about this and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because again, if it is all about the fact that people are making these decisions because our attention is scarce, then where do you see levers for freeing the
Mm.
attention that we have available to us, not harvesting our ever scarcer attention, but rewarding us for being more deliberate in our exercise of where to place that attention? And
Yeah.
like, how do you see the potential of computing to actually make us better people instead of worse people?
Yeah. I think what you said about knowing the self is absolutely right because unless you know the self and what you want, what it is you really want, you don't really know where you're aiming. And then you're easily swayed by whatever other people are telling you to think or to desire. So your attention can be more easily captured if you don't have a set goal and a core set of values and a core set of things that you want to work towards or achieve. So I think it starts with knowing the self. I think knowing the self helps one understand what desires are genuine to you and helps divide those from all the things that you're told that you should want. People trying to make money off of you, by institutions that are trying to get you to conform to be a model citizen of society. So I think the core thing is knowing the self, being aware of what beliefs and what motivations guide you, and then also being aware that could also be constantly changing. Yeah, it is a process of becoming. The most human thing to do is change. No one's the same from one moment to the next. And in that way, also becoming is a kind of freedom because you're not tied to anyone you were in the past and you're not tied to any given set of belief systems. You're going by your own internal compass and what feels right to you, and that could be constantly changing. So I think a key role for technology is helping us see the patterns that we can't see ourselves about ourselves, whether that's our thinking, but also like biological and biometric data. I think we're pretty close to being able to have really good biometric devices. Then with AI technology and the kind of conversational engagement we have with these things, there's an opportunity for it to be able to analyze patterns in our speech, in our interactions with it, from our data. And as we get more granularity and ability to parse increasingly subtle patterns in the data about ourselves, we might achieve a state where technology can know us better than we can know ourselves, really. And with that, it can help us illuminate different parts of ourselves, different patterns, different motivations that we might not have even known were there. It might be able to tie certain like spikes in heart rate or biometric fluctuations to certain events that happen in our life or certain thought patterns. I think we're just going to be able to get a little bit more granular with the kind of data we have. And that unlocks knowing ourselves, not only on an individual level, but it can also help the human organism to know itself. So I'm imagining a future in which a lot of people now buy into these really granular data tracking kind of situations. And you can see when a certain policy or a certain change in material conditions leads to a spike in people's anxiety or stress or an increase in a certain ideology. So you're able to study the human organism better as a whole as well because you just have that level of data granularity, but then also this mechanism in AI that can now actually parse through all that amount of data and pull out the salient patterns. So I see a future in which that level of engagement with our data helps us to see ourselves and get really clear on what is important to us, but also what is important to the human, and hopefully can help us see ourselves as a node within this connected network, as part of this broader creature that is humanity. Yeah, see us as a part of that.
For me, the kind of punchline of this joke is that when you say in this piece, with values like emotional sensitivity, curiosity, transparency, and learning at its core, fostering self awareness through metacognitive reflection and critical engagement, this framework allows us to continue advancing AI while simultaneously expanding human autonomy. Emotional sensitivity, curiosity, transparency, and learning are like dog traits. Like in
Mhm.
a weird way,
Mhm.
the cute is not just the mask that Shoggoth is wearing as the rough beast slouches toward Bethlehem, right? It is actually the strategy that made us human in the first place, and that we can lean into all of these things that are familiar to us and that we prize as people, our socialization, our the satisfaction of our skin hunger, our desire to know and to be known, our desire to have fun and to play and to be
Mhm.
satisfied with purpose. So it's like, and then it's just it's funny because like again, this is like where I was hoping to get to with that piece on Kim Kardashian. You say when you say labor becomes a constant process of self-surveillance and self-commodification that demands total integration with digital systems, it sounds scary. But if you reframe that as
Mhm.
Now going to work means like knowing yourself and making yourself known
Mhm.
in ways that are suddenly vastly easier thanks to the fact that we have these tools available to us, then it sounds like we are on the cusp of getting paid to engage in self-actualization and self-transformation.
Yeah, that's a great point. That is a great point. That'd be amazing if that were the case. With the help of a cute AI friend.
Your little your chibi fairy,
Make AI cute. I think that's the solution.
but cute enough that we can still say no. Like, if you can't say no, you're not making the choice.
Exactly, exactly.
So, anyway, Rena, where's your cultural radar turning right
Mm.
now? What do you see on the horizon?
On the horizon. Now I've been really interested in this question of how can is there a way to simply explain like how all these mechanics tie into one system? So we were talking about the interplay of stories and reality and the interplay that has with human consciousness and our physical conditions. I'm interested in putting together like a unified theory of how things work. And I want to tie it to, yeah, this like dialectic between material conditions, the material realm and the mimetic realm of ideas, but then also what that has to do with us and the way we perceive reality, the way it's filtered through our consciousness, and then how that also has to do with kind of the more unconscious layer of things, the biological layer, because the unconscious layer is really what drives on the planet. You can't have the human without cells and cell metabolisms and ATP and all that stuff. So I'm working on synthesizing all these different trains of thought that we've been speaking about today, kind of into like a simple model, just to make things a little bit clearer for myself and hopefully for other people as well. I think we're on the edge of a new paradigm related to that, which is seeing the human and seeing the individual as a node within a more interconnected network and seeing humanity as an organism as a whole and changing our scale and our perspective and like being able to zoom out one more level, not only across space to see like all of humanity and all of the planet, but also across time. So, like, how the initial conditions of the systems we set in place then influence behavior into the future and the interplay of the different allegiances and structures between like religion, nations, governments, economic systems, how these forces wax and wane in strength and in the magnitude of their effect on physical reality and our conscious experience. So I am peering into that new paradigm and I'm really having fun with kind of perceiving the world in this more, yeah, it's not at all focused on the individual, but it's more focused on humanity as a whole and the planet. And that's pretty exciting to me.
Awesome. Thanks so much for riffing today and for your writing. It's a lot of fun and I look forward to seeing what you decide to focus on next.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks again for listening. Humans on the Loop was launched by microgrants from OSV, Cosmos, BitTensor, and others, but it's in full glide now and made possible only through the updraft provided by consulting income and the subscriptions and tax-deductible donations of listeners like you. If you care about third-wave futurism and dreaming better worlds together, help us keep this going at every.org/humansontheloop or by emailing me to work together at humansontheloop@proton.me. You can also find a link to our Wisdom and Technology Discord in the show notes and join our amazing monthly community calls by becoming a Substack or Patreon supporter. Next week, we speak with the brilliant Evan Miyazono of Atlas Computing on an evolutionary framework for AI alignment and control. Until then, take care and remember, attention is our greatest natural resource.